Officer Jim Moreno was no stranger to the midnight shift, but there was something particularly unsettling about this night. The city was quiet. Too quiet, as if the usual hum of life had been swallowed up by the darkness. Jim's route took him past old warehouses on the city's outskirts, structures long abandoned and decaying under years of neglect. As he turned down an isolated street, his headlights illuminated something strange, the faint outline of a figure standing still in the shadows. He squinted, trying to make out any details, but the figure remained obscured. Slowing his cruiser, he approached cautiously, his hand hovering over his radio. As he drew nearer, the figure stepped into the light. It was a man dressed in an outdated uniform, one that resembled the style police wore back in the 1950s. The man's face was pale, his expression blank, and his eyes, empty, devoid of life, seemed to look straight through Jim. The sight was enough to send a shiver down his spine. Before he could react, the figure vanished, melting back into the shadows as though he had never been there at all. Jim quickly scanned the area, his heart pounding. He called out, his voice echoing through the empty street, but no one answered. Doubting what he'd seen, he shook his head and continued driving. But the image of the man stayed with him, an unsettling presence that lingered in the corners of his mind. The rest of the night would only grow stranger, as he was about to find out. As Jim tried to shake off the eerie encounter, his radio crackled to life. The dispatcher's voice was garbled, barely understandable, as if there was interference on the line. He adjusted the volume, leaning closer to hear. But all that came through was static and faint murmuring. Then, a voice cut through the static, a voice that didn't belong to any of his colleagues. It was low and raspy, as though the speaker was struggling to form each word. "Officer? Jim, we've been waiting," the voice said, each syllable drawn out in an unnervingly deliberate tone. Jim's blood ran cold. He grabbed the radio and replied, trying to maintain his composure. "Dispatch, do you copy? I'm receiving interference. Over." Silence filled the car, followed by another burst of static. Then the voice returned, clearer now. "You can't run. You're already one of us." A chill washed over him as he realized the voice sounded familiar, eerily similar to the one he'd heard on old recordings in the precinct archives. It was the voice of Officer Gray, a policeman who had gone missing on duty back in the 1950s, never to be seen again. Jim's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel. The voice faded, replaced by silence, but the sense of dread only grew stronger. He was beginning to realize that he might not be alone. Unable to shake the growing fear, Jim decided to return to the precinct, hoping the safety of familiar walls would calm his nerves. But as he drove, he noticed that the streets around him seemed to shift, taking on a dreamlike quality. Buildings that should have been closed down were suddenly lit up, their neon signs flickering in the darkness. He drove past people in old-fashioned clothes, their faces expressionless as they drifted down the sidewalks like ghosts from a bygone era. Glancing at his clock, Jim noticed it was stuck on 3:13 a.m., the exact time that Officer Gray had disappeared over 60 years ago. His heart raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening, but the truth was elusive, just out of reach. Then, as he turned a corner, he saw the figure from earlier, the man in the old uniform, waiting at the end of the street, his blank eyes staring directly at Jim. This time, the man's mouth moved, forming words that Jim couldn't hear but somehow understood. "It's your turn, officer," the man seemed to say. Jim's car sputtered, the engine faltering before dying completely, leaving him stranded in the middle of the deserted street. He felt trapped, as if some unseen force had pulled him into a world where the past and present had merged in a twisted reality. With no other choice, Jim exited the car and made his way on foot to the precinct, the only place that felt like it might offer some refuge. As he approached the building, he noticed it looked different. The familiar structure was now covered in grime, its windows shattered, and its walls bearing the scars of time. Pushing open the heavy front doors, he was greeted by the sound of distant whispers and the faint scent of smoke. as though the air itself was tainted by the memories of past horrors. Inside, the precinct was dark, lit only by the pale moonlight filtering through broken windows. Dust floated in the air, and every step echoed through the abandoned halls. His flashlight illuminated photos on the wall, old portraits of officers who had served in the past, including Officer Gray. Their faces seemed to watch him, eyes full of sorrow as though they were aware of his fate. The whispers grew louder, echoing off the walls, filling his ears with words he couldn't understand. He felt the presence of something unnatural, something that wanted him to feel every ounce of terror building in his chest. In that moment, he realized that the precinct had become a shrine to the officers who had vanished, a place where the spirits of the lost were bound to the walls and floors, forever haunting their last place of duty. Unable to bear the tension, Jim called out, his voice trembling. "Who's there? What do you want from me?" His words echoed, swallowed by the darkness. Then, out of the shadows, figures began to emerge. Officers clad in old uniforms, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes filled with sorrow and resentment. Among them was Officer Gray, his eyes fixed on Jim with an intensity that sent a wave of fear through him. "You've joined us, Jim," Gray said, his voice low and somber. "You ignored the signs, ignored the warnings. Now you'll stay here, with us." Jim shook his head, stepping back, his heart pounding as he felt a chill creep up his spine. He wanted to deny it, to tell himself this wasn't real, but the evidence was all around him. The spirits were real, their sorrow and anger palpable as they closed in, trapping him in the precinct. He could feel their emotions: pain, regret, and an overwhelming desire for release from the prison they'd been trapped in for decades. But Jim knew there was no escaping. He was as much a part of this place now as the walls themselves, and with every passing second, he felt his own spirit being pulled deeper into the darkness, becoming one with the ghosts of officers who had come before him. Realizing there was no escape, Jim accepted his fate, his fear transforming into a resigned sorrow. As the other spirits faded back into the darkness, he found himself alone in the precinct, his senses dulling, his mind slipping into a fog. The old clock on the wall chimed 3:13 a.m., the final mark of his time in the world of the living. He knew then that he would be forever bound to these halls, another lost soul in an endless night shift, watching over the empty streets from a world beyond. Now his own face would join the portraits on the wall, another nameless officer who had vanished without a trace. And when the next officer came, when they heard the whispers and saw the shadows, Jim would be there, waiting in the darkness, another ghost of the precinct reaching out to warn them of the fate that awaited those who dared to ignore the call of the spirits. Officer Lisa Chen was used to dealing with prank calls, but this one was different. It was past midnight, and the usual dispatch calls had tapered off. Just as she settled into the quiet, her radio crackled to life with an unexpected voice. The tone was low and trembled slightly, barely above a whisper. "Help me." "He's here," the voice said, filled with fear. Lisa's heart skipped a beat as she tried to gather more information, but the line went dead before she could respond. Moments later, the call repeated. This time, the voice was even weaker, sounding as though the caller was struggling to speak. "He's watching me," the voice whispered, fading into static. Lisa's skin prickled with an unsettling chill. She checked her system to trace the call, but there was no record of it, no indication of any number having dialed in. With a sense of foreboding creeping over her, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that someone was truly in danger. Or maybe it was something worse. With the eerie silence of the dispatch room pressing in around her, she resolved to investigate. She requested backup, but the line crackled as if something, or someone, was blocking her request. Swallowing her unease, she decided to go alone, unaware of the nightmare awaiting her. Following her instincts, Lisa tracked the calls to an abandoned house on the edge of town, a place rumored to be haunted for years. Her cruiser's headlights illuminated the eerie, overgrown property, casting long shadows across the yard. The house loomed dark and menacing, with broken windows and peeling paint, an embodiment of forgotten terror. She paused, gripping her flashlight tightly as she steeled herself before approaching the front door. The front porch creaked under her weight as she slowly climbed the steps, her flashlight casting eerie beams that barely cut through the oppressive darkness. She reached for the doorknob, which was ice cold to the touch, sending another chill down her spine. Just as she was about to push the door open, she heard the faintest whisper behind her. "Help me." Lisa whirled around, her flashlight scanning the darkness, but there was no one there. Taking a deep breath, she focused and opened the door, stepping into the house. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and something unidentifiable. Shadows clung to the walls, and she could almost feel eyes watching her from every corner. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the soft thud of her boots on the floorboards. Her flashlight revealed an old hallway, lined with faded portraits of unfamiliar faces. As she moved further in, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though she had intruded on a place where she didn't belong. Her steps echoed, each one seeming louder than the last, reverberating through the empty house. Suddenly, the radio on her hip crackled. "Help, he's here," came the same voice she'd heard earlier. The sound was warped and distorted, as though the words were coming from a great distance. Lisa raised the radio to her lips, whispering, "Where are you?" Her voice sounded small in the vast darkness. She waited, but the line went dead once more. Just then, she heard a faint creak from upstairs, like footsteps slowly pacing. Against every instinct screaming at her to turn back, Lisa climbed the staircase, each step heavier than the last. At the top, she was met with a corridor lined with closed doors. The silence was deafening, but she could hear a soft scratching noise coming from the door at the end of the hallway. Bracing herself, she approached, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. Lisa pushed open the door and was met with a strange sight. A small room filled with old photographs, letters, and trinkets, all arranged meticulously on a dusty table. The photos were of people she didn't recognize, their faces etched with expressions of fear and sadness. There were articles pinned to the wall, detailing disappearances that spanned decades. Her eyes widened as she noticed a common thread. Every person in the photos had called for help from the same abandoned house before vanishing without a trace. Among the articles, one headline caught her eye. Officer Emily Grant last seen responding to disturbance call. Emily had been her mentor, a seasoned officer who had vanished under mysterious circumstances years ago. As Lisa reached out to touch the photo of Emily, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Her breath became visible in the cold air, forming small clouds as she exhaled. Suddenly, a voice whispered in her ear, so close it felt like someone was standing beside her. "Leave, while you still can," the voice warned. Lisa spun around, but the room was empty. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and she could feel an invisible presence closing in on her. It was as if the house itself was alive, feeding on the fear of those who dared to enter. She stumbled back, realizing that she was in over her head, but the pull of the unknown kept her rooted in place. With her heart racing, Lisa clutched her flashlight tightly, feeling as though she was in the grip of something far beyond her control. She was about to leave when the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the room. Panic flared within her, but she forced herself to stay calm, scanning the room for another way out. As she searched, she felt a cold hand brush against her arm, and she nearly dropped her flashlight in shock. The room was silent, but a shadowy figure began to materialize in the corner. A woman in an old police uniform, her face shrouded in darkness. Lisa's heart thundered as she recognized the uniform. "Emily," she whispered, disbelief flooding her voice. The figure nodded slowly, her eyes empty yet pleading. "You must go, Lisa. He's here." Emily's voice echoed, her words barely audible. Lisa reached out, wanting to help, but Emily's form flickered, her image growing weaker. Just then, an ominous presence filled the room, and the air grew thick with malice. Lisa backed away, the oppressive energy pressing down on her, suffocating her. She could hear heavy footsteps approaching, each one vibrating through the floor as though the very house was trembling in fear. The footsteps drew closer, and Lisa knew she had to act fast. She turned towards the window, the only possible escape route, and smashed it open with her flashlight. As she scrambled out, sharp glass edges cut into her arms, but the pain barely registered. She landed outside in the cold night air, gasping for breath, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She glanced back at the house, expecting to see Emily's figure in the window, but there was nothing, only darkness staring back at her. Stumbling back to her cruiser, she grabbed the radio, her hands shaking. She tried to report what had happened, but her words came out in a breathless rush, barely making sense. Her fellow officers arrived minutes later, but when they searched the house, there was no sign of the room filled with memories, no trace of Emily, and no evidence that anyone had been there at all. The house remained silent, as if it had swallowed the secrets and spirits within its walls once more. To this day, Lisa can't shake the feeling that someone, or something, still watches her, a reminder of the night she faced a haunted past she couldn't quite escape. And every now and then, on the quietest of nights, she swears she hears a familiar whisper on the wind, calling her back to the place where the spirits of the lost are forever bound. Officer Harris had been on the force for years, but there was something different about this call. The dispatcher's voice had a strange tone, as if they too felt uneasy about sending someone to investigate the old Miller house. He parked his cruiser in front, the headlights casting long shadows that flickered against the house's peeling paint and broken windows. The place had stood vacant for years, its history shrouded in grim stories of the unsolved murders that had happened inside decades ago. The house was quiet, eerily so. Only the sound of his boots crunching on dead leaves filled the night air as he approached the porch. The front door, unlocked and slightly ajar, creaked open, as though it had been waiting for him. Just inside the entryway, his radio crackled to life, but all he heard was static. He adjusted the volume, expecting a message from dispatch, but instead, faint whispers seemed to emerge, fading in and out. He froze, listening intently, but soon the sound vanished, leaving an oppressive silence in its place. Taking a deep breath, Harris stepped into the living room. His flashlight swept over the room, revealing old furniture shrouded in dust, broken glass scattered across the floor, and, most disturbingly, a collection of photographs spread out on a table. He leaned closer, shining his light on the images. Each one showed people with blurred faces, and in the background of every photo, a shadowy figure lurked. The figure seemed to be watching the subjects, and its indistinct form gave off an unsettling aura. Harris felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had seen strange things in his career, but something about these photos was deeply wrong, as if they had captured moments no camera should have witnessed. Determined to investigate further, Harris moved deeper into the house, each step filling him with a growing sense of unease. His flashlight flickered, casting brief, erratic shadows across the walls, each one seeming to stretch out and reach toward him. As he entered the hallway, he heard it again, a faint whisper. The sound was barely audible, yet it seemed to echo in his mind. It called his name softly, as if someone just out of sight was beckoning him closer. He stopped, swallowing the lump in his throat, and forced himself to continue down the narrow hallway. At the end, he found a staircase leading to the second floor. The creaking wood underfoot added a sense of foreboding with every step, and as he climbed, the whispering grew louder, transforming into a chorus of soft voices. They whispered words he couldn't quite understand. But one thing was clear. They knew him. They spoke his name, his fears, and seemed to mock him with secrets he couldn't comprehend. At the top of the stairs, Harris found a single door partially open, leading to a small room filled with old newspaper clippings, faded photographs, and case files. His flashlight revealed headlines that documented the house's dark past: gruesome murders, strange disappearances, and witnesses who claimed to have seen apparitions. His light passed over a dusty mirror in the corner of the room, and as he looked into it, he froze. Behind him, in the reflection, stood a figure, a shadowy woman with eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. Heart pounding, Harris whipped around, but the room was empty. He let out a shaky breath, chalking it up to stress and fatigue, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck prickling as he examined the room more closely. There, on a nearby table, lay an evidence bag with a faded tag, Case 2317. Harris frowned. That number was familiar. It belonged to the cold case file of a missing girl from 2 decades ago. But what was it doing here, in this abandoned house? He reached out to pick up the bag, but the moment his fingers touched it, a shock of cold pierced through his hand. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding him with accusations and pleas for justice. Images flashed through his mind, visions of the missing girl, alone and terrified, her face distorted with fear. Then came the glimpses of another figure, a shadowed man looming over her, his intentions clear and sinister. Harris stumbled back, clutching his head as the visions continued to assault his mind. He could hear the girl's voice now, clear and desperate, crying for help. "Please," she whispered, "don't leave me." He looked around the room, desperate to find her, to save her, but he was alone. Only the shadows seemed to move, twisting and writhing as though they were alive, eager to pull him into their dark embrace. As Harris backed toward the door, a chilling realization washed over him. The house wasn't just a place of tragedy. It was a prison, holding the souls of those who had suffered within its walls. He felt a sudden, oppressive weight in the room, like an unseen presence pressing down on him. His every instinct screamed at him to leave, but something stronger, some inexplicable compulsion, held him in place. A low, rumbling sound filled the room, and Harris felt the temperature drop even further. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and he shivered uncontrollably. Suddenly, the door he had come through slammed shut, trapping him inside. Panic surged through him as he tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. His radio crackled again, and this time, the static was pierced by a voice. It wasn't the dispatcher. It was a woman, whispering his name, each syllable dripping with malice. "Officer Harris," the voice drawled, sending a jolt of terror through him. He recognized it. It was the voice of the girl from his vision. But this time, it wasn't pleading. It was taunting, mocking him. "You're just like him. You won't help, will you?" The accusation stung, and he clenched his fists, feeling both the weight of her words and the truth behind them. He had failed to solve her case, just as he had failed so many others. Desperate to escape, Harris began frantically searching the room for a way out. His flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and he could feel the presence growing closer, surrounding him like a predator stalking its prey. He stumbled upon a hidden compartment in the floor, covered in dust and cobwebs. Inside, he found something unexpected: a diary, bound in worn leather and covered in strange symbols. As he opened it, he saw entries written in a childish scrawl, detailing the last days of the missing girl. She described the man who had taken her, the horrors he inflicted, and her desperate hope that someone would come to save her. Harris felt a pang of guilt as he read her final entry. "They'll never find me. No one will. But maybe I can make them see." The last line was smudged, as if written in a hurry, but it chilled him to the bone. "I will never let him leave this place." Harris's heart raced as he understood the meaning behind her words. She wasn't just a victim. She was now part of the house, a vengeful spirit bound by her rage and sorrow. Part 6. The Last Stand. Harris barely had time to process the revelation before the air around him grew colder still. Shadows gathered, swirling like a storm, and he could feel the girl's presence pressing closer. Her laughter filled the room, a sound that was equal parts innocent and menacing. "You're just like him," she repeated, her voice echoing from all around. "You let me die, and now you'll stay here, with me." The shadows closed in, and Harris felt his strength fading. His flashlight died, plunging him into total darkness. He could feel cold hands gripping his arms, pulling him down, and he struggled to break free, but it was no use. The girl's voice whispered in his ear, her tone triumphant. "This is your punishment. Welcome to my prison." As the darkness consumed him, Harris's final thought was a plea for forgiveness, for peace, for anything to save him from the fate he had sealed. But in the end, his cries went unheard, lost in the silent depths of the haunted house. His last breath echoed through the empty halls, joining the countless other voices trapped in the shadows, forever bound to the place he had dared to enter alone.